The history of Westeros is often spoken of as a single, unified story, yet the very title of its sovereign betrays a fractured and bloody past. When we hear the words, King of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, we are not merely listening to a formal royal address. We are hearing the echo of 3 separate conquests and the displacement of entire civilizations. Before the Iron Throne was forged, and even before the first stone of Winterfell was laid, there was a world that belonged to something else entirely. It was the Dawn Age, a time of giants and the children of the forest who lived in a magical harmony with a land that had never known the bite of a human blade. But this peace was destined to be shattered by a tide of invaders from across the sea who would change the face of the continent forever. Before we dive deeper, make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't and hit the notification bell. The saga begins with the First Men who crossed into Westeros from the continent of Essos. They did not arrive by ship, but by foot, traversing a land bridge that once connected the 2 continents at a point we now call the Stepstones. This was an invasion defined by bronze and blood. The First Men brought with them tools and weapons that the children of the forest, with their obsidian blades and woodcraft, simply could not match. It was not a fair fight, it was a slaughter. In their fear and desperation to tame the wild, the First Men began to hack down the sacred weirwood trees. They believed these white trees, with their weeping red sap, gave the children a magical or religious edge in battle, and so they burned them to the ground. The children of the forest fought back with the only power they had, the ancient magic of the earth. In a final, desperate act to stem the tide of humanity, they called upon the Hammer of the Waters. Using their magical abilities, they shattered the land bridge that connected Essos and Westeros, turning the solid earth into a flooded area of broken islands. They hoped that by drowning the path, the invasion would stop. But the magic came too late. The First Men had already established their foothold in Dorne and were pushing steadily northward, claiming the majority of the spoils for themselves. After generations of brutal warfare, a truce was finally struck, known to history as the Pact. It was a peace born of exhaustion. The children of the forest were given what amounted to crumbs, permitted to live only in the deepest, darkest forests, while the First Men claimed the open lands and the fertile valleys. For a time, there was harmony. A strange cultural shift occurred during this period of peace. The victors were changed by the land they had stolen. The First Men eventually abandoned their original ways and adopted the religion of the very people they had displaced, kneeling before the old gods of the forest. However, the peace of the Pact was soon threatened by an existential horror. The first long night arrived, and with it the others, an army of the undead that threatened to extinguish all life. To survive, the children of the forest and the First Men realized they had to set aside their history of blood. They worked together, combining the martial strength of men with the magical abilities of the children. They succeeded in pushing the others back into the frozen shadows of the far north, and the wall was erected to ensure the threat remained caged. But as they processed their survival against the undead, a new threat was already gathering in the east. The second great wave of migration was the Andal invasion. Like the First Men before them, the Andals came from Essos, though from a different region entirely. They did not cross a land bridge, they arrived by ship, landing in the Vale. The Andals brought with them a new religion, the faith of the Seven, which stood in direct, violent conflict with the old gods of the First Men. This chapter of history is steeped in a dark irony that feels like karma. The Andals did to the First Men exactly what the First Men had previously done to the children and the giants. It was a case of the conquerors being given a taste of their own medicine. Just as the First Men once held a technological advantage over the children, the Andals now possessed better weapons and tools than the First Men. With iron and zeal, the Andals succeeded in taking over the majority of Westeros. They displaced the First Men, toppled their kingdoms, and carved the 7-pointed star into the land. Only the north remained a bastion of the old ways, successfully resisting the Andal tide and remaining loyal to the blood of the First Men. In the west, the Iron Islands continued to do their own thing, worshipping the drowned god. Yet, for most of the continent, the Andal way of life took root, big time. Even houses like the Blackwoods in the Riverlands, who still trace their ancestry back to the First Men, became rare islands in an Andal sea. The final piece of the Westerosi puzzle came not from a desire for conquest, but from a desperate flight for survival, the arrival of the Rhoynar. The Rhoynar were a civilization that lived along the Rhoyne, a massive, magical river in Essos that served as their lifeblood. Their downfall came at the hands of the ever-expanding Valyrian freehold. Seeing the writing on the wall and realizing they could not win against the Dragon Lords, a legendary leader named Nymeria of Nysa took charge. She gathered her people into 10,000 ships and began bouncing around from place to place, fleeing the Valyrians in search of a new home. They eventually settled in Dorne. Nymeria's arrival was not a typical invasion. She married into House Martell, and the two cultures began to blend together. This infusion of Rhoynar influence gave Dorne a unique identity that separated it from the Andal-dominated kingdoms to the north. Dorne became the last kingdom to remain independent, clinging heavily to its Rhoynar roots even as the Faith of the Seven attempted to take hold. In the books, Westeros is a complex melting pot of these three civilizations: the Rhoynar, the Andals, and the First Men. One could argue that the Andals were the most successful, as they are currently on top, with most great houses conforming to their way of life and their religion. Yet the older bloodlines have not been erased. The North remains fiercely proud of its descent from the First Men. The Iron Islanders maintain their distinct traditions, and the Rhoynar legacy lives on in the spirit of Dorne. The king of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men sits upon a throne that represents thousands of years of displacement, survival, and the slow, bloody forging of a single realm from three very different peoples.